Yo, yo, yo. There's a new paper out, which is to say, I have a new paper out. Public Preferences and Reality, Crime Rates Among 70 Immigrant Groups in the Netherlands. So I've been doing this paper, which with this Dutch colleague, who's some kind of student who speaks Dutch, and I don't speak Dutch, well, not very good. And so the basic idea of this paper is that we compiled the crime rates of immigrant groups in the Netherlands, and we compared these to the usual predictors, national IQs, and Muslim percentage of the home countries. Furthermore, we look at the preferences that people have for different immigrant groups coming to their country. Whether you want more Somalis or more Swiss. That's something you can just ask people about. And then, of course, we look at how these preferences relate to actual crime levels, which is a replication of the design that Noah Carl came up with and that partially got him fired. So the paper you can find on ResearchGate, and so you can just read it by yourself. To start up with, in 2017, I presented a talk on a meta-analysis of these country-level predictors of immigrant groups. And so in this meta-analysis, we have data for 6 different countries: Germany, Denmark, Finland, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. So mainly North European countries that have the most and the most annoying immigrants. So in each of these studies, you have some kind of measure of how well an immigrant group is doing, whether it's a crime rate, their education level, income level, unemployment, something. Preferably, you have something like the S factor, kind of a general score of how well the immigrants are doing. And so if you look at this, and you look at the home country IQs from Richard Lynn, or the Pew Research Muslim percentage, what you do is that you just correlate these and see whether the groups that come from high IQ countries or low Muslim percentage, whether they tend to do better. And we see that they do on average. It should be noted here that I've reversed the Muslim one because all the Muslim values are negative, right? More Muslim groups have higher crime and so on. And so we basically multiplied by -1. So Muslim here means non-Muslim. So what we see overall is that if you look at measures like general factor score, S factor, national IQ predicts immigrant performance about correlation 0.6 or so, and it's maybe about 0.5 or so if you look at individual outcomes like income or education or something. But it really varies a lot by country, and the reason for this is that some studies don't have many origin groups. So, for instance, I think the Finnish study here only has crime. That's the green circle and the green triangle. It only has crime because there's only one study I could find that has these outcomes for immigrant groups in Finland, and I think this study only has like 11 or 20 groups or something. Whereas the Danish study, the Danish data that's on this plot is based on 70 groups, so much larger sample of groups, and so it can matter a lot which groups you've included or not. Also, many countries don't have data as far as I know, so there's a lot of work to be done still, but overall we see that national IQs and Muslim percents, they do predict outcomes as you'd expect. So for this study, we looked to do a new Dutch study. There is one Dutch study in the previous slide, and but it's based on an old report that I found that's in Dutch that only covers, I think, data from 2002, and so it's basically not optimal because it's too old and the sample is not as large as it could be because there's only data for a single year, right? So fortunately, the Dutch Central Bureau of Statistics, Centraal Bureau voor die Statistiek, they publish the arrest rates and the suspect rates of immigrant groups in the Netherlands, and they also allow you to calculate a per capita rate for each group, and they give you data for all large groups, which they have the largest 70 groups. So that's a lot of stuff, a lot of data, and also have the natives. So you have 71 groups in total. Furthermore, you can break it down by generation, first or second generation, if you think that has some big effect. Finally, we used an online poll of 200 people living in the Netherlands, and follows the same setup as Noah Carl used in his study. which is to say that for each person we ask them about each origin group and whether they want more of this group or fewer or the same or none. So it's 4 options, and to calculate the immigrant preference, you take the 2 okay, status quo, and more immigrants, and then you subtract the ones that are opposed, and from this you kind of get a favoritism score, right, or an opposition score if you do it the other way around. We use Prolific for this, which is very neat, and I recommend it. If we just take a look at the overall pattern, we don't see too many surprises. Relative crime rates from Western countries, it's low, and Asian countries low. It's high from the Middle East, and it's high from many African countries. The exception here is South Africa, down here, which has quite low crime rate, and it probably has the obvious reason that the people coming from South Africa aren't black Africans, but it's white Dutch ex-colonial people returning, so returnees as they're called. So these are Afrikaans speakers, and Afrikaans is a Dutch-derived, kind of simplified Dutch language. So they probably can integrate very easily in the Netherlands, and that's why they cause few problems. One thing special about the Netherlands is these groups over here that we'll be talking about. These are the old colonies of the Netherlands. If we kind of take a Steven Pinker view of it, we can look at the decline of violence. And if our data series begins in 2005, that's the first data they had, and it ends in, I think, 2018, the latest data they have. And if we look at so these are the suspect rates, which had the best data coverage. And we see that more or less these have declined by about 50% for each group, and also for the country overall, close. And which is to say that if we then take a kind of look at the relative crime rates, they have been mostly stable. There is some increase around 2010. It seems to cover a lot of immigrant groups that kind of have a spike in 2010. So I don't know exactly what this is caused by, and we couldn't figure it out. But we were guessing they changed the definition of something in the software they used to compile the data, or maybe some legal circumstance changed how they classify immigrants. But basically, you see the thing is that if you look at this, it looks like crime is going down, and it's okay with immigrants. And if you look at this, you see that actually the differences in crime rates between these immigrant groups is more or less constant, which is to say that if you take in more crime-prone immigrants, your crime rate will go up compared to if you didn't take them. But overall, it will probably decline because everybody declines so fast currently, anyway. So this kind of stuff doesn't look like we're going into a big civil war, and this kind of looks like business as usual. If you do it by generation, you aren't too surprised. We just have the same colors as before, and we plot them by these the line type. So the second generation declines pretty much as the first generation, and so nothing too surprising there. If we then do the national IQ, we see that Origin IQ predicts crime rates very well. We have a bunch of East Asians down here, very low crime rates. This is kind of a cluster of mainly European origins that have similar crime rates and IQs to the Netherlands. And then everybody else is over here, and some of these are low crime, like South Africa we talked about, or India, which is sort of Asian, and some of the less smart Asians. And then we have a bunch of Muslims over here, and some Africans, and as well as the ex-colonies. And so we see that National IQ does a reasonable job of predicting the crime rates here, 0.64, which is quite nice for social science. If instead we look at the Muslim percentage, we look at countries that have 0% Muslims, approximately, and over here the countries that have about 100% Muslims. And so we see that these over here are higher in crime, 0.45, weaker than the national IQ in this data set. If you do these plots and you weigh them by the size of the immigrant group, you don't really change results much. So this value is weighed by the size, and this one is not, so it's more or less the same. That's also true for the immigrant one. So the main thing to note is the high crime rate of some of these groups over here. And so the Netherlands, Antilles, and the Suriname, these are the old and former, or I think maybe current, Dutch colonial possessions that are in either the Caribbean or just on the north side of South America. So these are some kind of Native American or groups, and somehow they arrive in Netherlands in large proportions because of the colonial stuff. They probably have some kind of legal agreement, and they have quite high crime rates. If we then look at the country preferences, we have this chart here. So this is kind of a direct replication of NORCAL, except for the Netherlands. And so we see that overall people have preferences that make sense from a rational perspective. Correlation 4-6 between actual crime rates seen, these are the suspect rates, and the whether you have more opposition to people. So see, the scale is Y values means more opposition, right? So lower values means people are not really much opposed to these, and about 0 means they're kind of neutral, so to say. Up here, we have the groups that Dutch people have the most opposition to, and so these are a bunch of African countries, Muslim countries, various others. Down here we have more or less all the Asians and West Europeans. These two are the ex-possession, the colonial possessions. So we can see that these are big outliers. They don't have high opposition. In Netherlands, their people are quite welcoming to these people, but they have high crime rates. So there seems to be some other reason why Dutch people are okay with them. And so to investigate this, I did some regressions where we look at other predictors of whether some country or immigrant group is welcome in the Netherlands. And to do that, we use the continental coding. So for a dummy for each country, which kind of region of the world it's in. And this is the United Nations continental coding, which has a 5-way split. And if we want something more fine-grained, I've made this one based on the regional coding, which kind of makes more sense. So it depends on how fine-grained control for geographical dummies you want. If we gotta hide me, sorry ladies. If we then look at this table here, what we have is this first model is just we predict people's preferences for immigrants just using the suspect rate, the crime rate. And we see that this has the same more or less value as we saw on the plot before. The reason for the difference, in case someone is wondering, is that apparently weighted correlations are a bit different from weighted regressions in how they use the weights. I don't know exactly how it works, but they give results that are slightly not the same, but almost the same. If we then add a dummy for the colonial relationship, and this is just whether the country was a former Dutch colony or a current Dutch colony. So it's these countries, as well as I think there's one more, some Asian country. Indonesia, I think, is the former one. And so we add a dummy for this one, and we see adding the dummy makes crime rate more predictive of preferences, just as we expect from the plot, right? Because these were the outlier countries, and so we add a dummy that takes them into account, and then the pattern becomes more clear with the crime rate. If we then also add a variable for Muslim, we see that it's quite strong. So even controlling for the crime rate and the colonial, then people still have a quite much more hostility towards Muslim groups. This can be for multiple reasons. It not necessarily because they actually dislike Muslims per se, but because people don't have accurate views of which countries have super high crime rates. I mean, the stereotype is roughly accurate, but it's only roughly accurate. So, for instance, there's probably a lot of difference between different countries in the Middle East, but these aren't known to people. So, in people's mental mind, they probably just assign kind of a rough preference for each Middle Eastern country that's not related to the crime rate, but among Muslim groups. But it does maybe correlate with the Muslim percentage. Or it can be cultural hostility towards Muslims. Maybe you don't like your daughters harassed by Muslim grooming gangs, or you don't like female circumcision or Muslim attacks on free speech. I mean, there can be many reasons why you don't like this. If we add dummies for the continental, the geographical, they are here in this model, model 4, and we see that suspect rate, the crime rate keeps being predictive of preferences. Muslim is still predictive, and colonial keeps its predictive. So what these say is that we use the European continent as a reference, and then we compare the other ones. So we see that people have a high preference for Asians, even controlling for these, and nothing else really stands out too much. So whatever the crime rate stuff, people still have some preference for Asians, and also taking into account Muslim preference, which is interesting. So kind of Asians are non-threatening to Dutch people. If we go further and we add more the smaller control for region dummies, we then set Northwest Europe as the reference, and we can see there's a bunch of significant things here. The 3 stars means it's very unlikely to be some kind of chance finding. And so what we see is that there's a bunch of countries that people dislike or like more, depending on this or that. The interesting thing to see is that when you add more continental dummies, then the suspect rates become non-significant. Well, actually, the p-value is about 4% or something. So it is significant by standards, but it's not in this. And the reason for this is probably that people don't really memorize crime rates of immigrant groups in that enough detail. They use some of these groups of countries as proxies. Somehow a Muslim is still significant and colonial is still significant. So even controlling for all this stuff, people still there's still some effect of hostility towards Muslim countries, which is interesting. If we want to think of this in a kind of conceptual way, we can say that this is how I think about it. So we have these countries of origin, and they vary in various traits, and these can be like time preference or national IQs or tendency towards religion, superstitiousness, industriousness, creativity, whatever you want. When then you get some immigrants that go to a country, they keep these traits to some extent. They definitely keep the intelligence stuff and the religion stuff to a large extent, and they probably become more similar to the culture they integrate into to some degree, and it depends on which trait you're looking at. But also immigration traits you end up in the population depends on immigrant selection. So if you have 2 countries that are roughly the same, let's say you're getting immigrants from Norway and from Denmark, but in Norway you take a bunch of peasants, and from Denmark you take the elite from Copenhagen, you're going to end up with Danes and Norwegians that aren't quite the same. And it's obvious why this is the case, right? So a lot of countries have different levels of selection, and there's no good measures of this, or it's kind of tricky to measure at least. But we definitely know that it impacts this. Anyway, so now that you have immigrant groups in your country and they have these and that traits, they're going to have different crime rates depending on time preference, IQ, religion, hostility, laziness, who knows, all these things. It's also modified by contextual factors, which could be stuff whether the police is lenient or the opposite, whether the police kind of harass them, because these are the measured crime rates, right, or the ones that we see. And furthermore, it can be like age or sex pattern. If you only get young men from one population, they're going to be higher in crime than if you get a lot of old women, right? Because young men are much more criminal prone. People's perceptions or stereotypes are then to some degree caused by these actual crime rates, as well as people's proxies and the media. And so, as I've been saying, most people don't sit around and they don't go to the website of statistics and go like, so people from Indonesia have a crime rate that's relative to Dutch of 1. People from Malaysia have one of 1.5, so they're 50% more. They don't do that. They just kind of get like a rough idea of which groups are criminal and which ones are not. So this rough idea is probably based on media reports over here, as well as various proxies, like whether it's from a rich country or from Africa or not, or, you know. Finally then, people have some kind of preference for different countries that is based on both the perceptions of crime rates, and also various special relationships. So the special relationship is the only post hoc thing here, and that really relates to the colonial relationships. It can also be things like whether you're a neighboring country, because it's much harder to keep people out if they live right next to you, right? You basically have to build a wall. But if if people from that country need to cross an ocean to get to you, it's very easy to keep them out, right? So that's the overall model. So more work to do is that we need to cover more countries. Preferably we'd have these immigrant kind of countries for every Western country and every origin. That would be the ideal. Unfortunately, most of this data is not public, and when it is public, it's often in a bad format and in a local language. So let's say you want to do France. France, they kind of have the ban on ethnic data, but not necessarily on nationality data. So you can use citizenship nationality data, but that doesn't tell you about people who change citizenship and so on. So there's problems for this kind of thing. And it's going to be in French, right? So if you don't read French like me, then you're going to have to find someone who reads French and collaborate. So it takes a lot of time to cover all these countries, and it would be very helpful if more people would help me out. Just basically send me a clean data set of some kind of measure of immigrant groups, preferably more than 10 groups, crime rates, incomes, whatever. Then it's very easy to do the analysis. Most of the time is spent on cleaning the data and finding it. We also need to do more of these surveys about preferences. I've seen in 3 different surveys now that, for instance, the countries that Danes prefer are almost perfectly correlated with the countries that the British prefer. I haven't checked the ones with the Dutch so far, but it would be nice to kind of maybe do a survey of 10 countries at the same time and then see if they all agree or very much agree. So that would suggest that people aren't really modifying their preferences to something specifically happening in their country, but more like they have the same kind of proxies. Everybody wants immigrant groups from which countries or not. Finally, we have the immigrant selectiveness, selectivity. It is possible to estimate this. There are data sets like the brain drain database, which kind of has a measure of how selected immigrant people are who emigrate from a given country. Whether it's the educational elite or whether it's peasants, basically. It's also tricky to do because immigrants have arrived at different times. So maybe the Afghans who left in 1980 are quite different types of Afghanis than the ones who left in 2010. Like maybe they're from a different region of Afghanistan. They could be, maybe one of them is Shia Muslims and the other one is Sunni Muslims. I don't really know. But you would have to basically look at every country pair and look at the immigration history and try to make some kind of estimate. Or you can do rough stuff like colonial relationships or neighbors. So you can kind of get like a traveling distance measure. Of course, to say if you want more of this stuff, you know how to give me money, then I can be more like this and you can get more videos like this one. So these are the references, and that's basically it for today.